all the hospitality when I was down in Australia in September and early October. Lisa wanted me to actually ask everybody here as a quick icebreaker if anybody can name two bordering states of the state of Indiana in the United States of America without looking at Google Maps, and put it in the chat. She had everybody at zero actually getting this one, so I will just put up a quick picture of where Indiana is in the state of or in the United States. I live right on the south end of Lake Michigan there, although I'm currently in New York. So now yeah, close. Whoever had Iowa, Wisconsin, you're actually in the neighborhood at least, so that's pretty good. It borders Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and it might touch Tennessee. Now I have to actually look at my own geography. But anyways, there you go. That's where I live. So we're going to talk a little bit about what holds for records management and compliance for 2024. I want to talk a little bit about the macro trends, anyways, as we exit 2023. There's a few kind of interesting things that the regulators and the governments are taking note of, or thinking about, or talking about, and even trying to promulgate some things around. So we'll cover that. What the modern data landscape looks like. I'm going to revisit. If you were on the prior call, you're going to see 2 or 3 similar slides, but that's it, because I just want to make sure everybody kind of has our frame of reference around what we think of as a modern data landscape. And then we get into the top 10 predictions of 2024, because this time of year, everybody has to do their predictions. All right, so these are not all the trends that there are out there, but these are some of the macro trends that really drive our data and information environments. And ultimately, that's what drives compliance and records and all the things that we care about. And so I'm as I go through this, you'll see I'm going to start kind of at a higher level and keep drilling down, right? What's impacting how information is created, consumed, and used? And then ultimately, what does that mean for us and how we have to actually govern it, retain it, control it, protect it, and all those things that we do as professionals in this industry. So the first thing is AI goes mainstream, right? Everybody, unless you were living under a rock, a very, very big rock, you didn't realize what was happening this year. AI has finally gone mainstream, and it really was driven by the generative AI, mass market introduction of a generative AI solution, open AI from ChatGPT, and many, many other large language models. And I won't go through them in any detail, but the scope and the scale of the data that's used in these models just over the last year dwarfs and is like literally a order of magnitude and multiple orders of magnitude above the data that were in any AI models even just a few years ago. As with any good thing, or with anything that seems to be a little bit outside of their control, the government has kind of invited themselves to this party, to the AI party. Part of it's a good thing and part of it's not, but you'll see that the governments are trying to figure out their role here, right? The AI genie's out of the bottle. At one point, Elon Musk and a few other people came out and said, hey, let's have a 6-month moratorium on the use of AI. And that obviously went nowhere. The genie's out of the bottle. That's not gonna happen. So now it's a matter of, as governments, how do you find the balance and where do they actually play? Then this other trend, which is when you think about risk management, and I know this is an order, this is a bit above sometimes where we think, right? We're trying to figure out, well, how do I manage this set of data? How do I deal with this retention obligation? How do I deal with this legal obligation? Really, in a lot of ways, this is all about managing risk and compliance, right? And so data is obviously central to doing that. And what's interesting today, though, is when you look at how risk officers look at this, and risk teams and audit teams, it's all around the data now, because data is what's actually driving so much of what's happening in organizations. And I've got some data to support that as well, and to show you. And then you're going to see continued increase in regulations and enforcement around that add to the complexity of this environment. And then finally, cybersecurity and resilience are major drivers right now for records and governance solutions. So a number of nation states and here in the U.S., but across the globe, and I have the references U.S., U.K., and Australia, have codified very specific resiliency requirements around protecting data and cyber and business resiliency. And it actually goes to this concept that data now also has an impact and impacts our national interest and our thoughts around the national interest of the impact of organizations and also that drive our data sovereign or the sovereignty of the data that we're maintaining. So all of these are macro trends as we exit 2023. All of these create data and then create a series of obligations that we have to do something with. All right, so the first thing I wanted to go over was, all right, so what's the role of AI in government? And as I indicated before, the government at first was, a few people were like, oh, well, we have to start to, regulate AI. We've got to do something about it. It's growing too fast. It could destroy the world, all those things. But what really has happened is governments have realized, as they have in the past, that the growth, the complexity, the rate at which this is evolving is way too fast for how legislation moves. Obviously, in Australia, legislation has its own path. It takes time. In the US, it takes a lot of time. Same in the EU. By the time you actually create and codify something that gets accepted in the EU and it goes out, it's years. And so we're moving at much more rapid rates in the AI market. So what Australia, the UK, and the US have all done at various levels have basically produced frameworks. It's saying, here's a set of responsible AI ethics, guidelines, frameworks that we would like to see companies use or adopt as they develop AI solutions. So this is really the first foray where you're seeing actually the government try and at least set some boundaries. I don't see any of these governments, I mean, somebody will do it, but to have an actual practical effect in AI, nobody's going to promulgate any rule or statute that is going to somehow govern AI and restrict it significantly. It's all going to be on the margins around understanding what the AI is doing, understanding the records around it, things like that. But as far as creating a construct that actually controls the development of AI, unlikely to happen, certainly in 2024. One other thing, as I go through a lot of what I'm talking about, I do reference not just what happens here in the US, I do reference EU or the UK. And I'm not doing it because I think that it's just kind of interesting to talk about one or the other, but rather, anytime I do this, because I work globally and I've worked globally for a number of years, when we see a trend in one place that's likely to be adopted somewhere else, it's kind of important to understand that because we don't exist in a vacuum anymore. Our companies are global. Our governments actually look at things that other governments have adopted. So there's a lot of give and take here. And so that's why I actually often leverage or use what we see in one place and talk about it somewhere else. GDPR is the best example, right? GDPR was the privacy regulation developed in the EU. If I and most of you, if you don't know where Indiana is, maybe you do or don't know where Virginia is or California or the state of Colorado. In the U.S., each of the states have adopted, or a number of the states have adopted their own privacy regulation. We don't have a federal and national regulation, but in a way, it also doesn't matter because it looks like GDPR, right? And so GDPR set the framework of how privacy is dealt with. And other states, in this case, states in the US, have adopted that. And of course, other countries in the Middle East have adopted GDPR's framework. Australia is adopting many of the elements of GDPR's framework. So when I talk about these other governments and state actions, it's because it's relevant and likely to be adopted or seen somewhere else. So one of the first things that's happened, and it surprised me a little bit because I figured we'd get into 2024 before we started to really see our first enforcement actions on AI. There actually was an AI privacy enforcement action in the EU last year. And it was privacy focused, which is unsurprising, right? The EU takes privacy seriously. They have many years on us in adopting a framework. They've got the Data Protection Board. But basically, they actually had a dedicated task force set up to coordinate potential enforcement actions against ChatGPT and OpenAI because they were concerned and uncertain as to what kind of privacy exposure there might be with ChatGPT, just the way it was trained and the way it's used. Because again, as many of you may know, if you actually initiate prompts um, and provide prompts, that data can become part of the AI framework and the models that are used and the data that's available to actually be used in generative AI. And so they were trying to understand that exposure. Italy actually briefly banned ChatGPT until they made changes, in particular to deal with um, their rules and then the EU rules around age groups and their access to certain types of information and content. So this was just a really good example of look, everybody's trying to figure out what their role is. There is potential exposure, right, around privacy and other information. We've seen confidentiality issues here in a case with Samsung. And if anybody wants to talk about me to talk about it, just put it in the chat, and I'll add it to the end of my topic or my talk. But the point is that these enforcement actions and actions by the government on discrete issues around AI are likely to continue. Okay, so now I'm going to divert here a little bit, and I'm going to talk about risk management. And I know that many of us who work in compliance functions or legal or in records functions, at first, obviously we manage levels of risk. That's what we do. But the idea around the level of risk or a risk management function, true risk management function, a chief risk officer, we think of that as a much broader set of topics that they cover, which they certainly do, as evidenced here. So this is a survey that was actually done by KPMG, and this survey is actually looking at global CROs, chief risk officers, across a range of industries, everything from energy to healthcare. You can see it on the bottom. I've got the reference in here. And you can see the range of kind of challenges that a risk management function looks at, everything from regulatory changes all the way down to market risks, export export controls, geopolitical risks. But the reason I brought this up is it's interesting. First, we all would imagine at some level, if you're in risk management, the need and the rate of regulatory change and compliance issues is high on your list. That's kind of almost what you do for a living. So not too surprising. But cybersecurity threats was the number two risk that chief risk officers think about. Now, if you're like if you're a CISO, if you're a CIO, maybe even if you're a chief legal officer, you think cyber is pretty high on the list. Chief risk officers have all these other dynamics that they have to manage. They're thinking about supply chain, reputational damage, all these other things. Cyber is this high. The risk in cyber is this high that it's on the list. What this does, though, is it tells us a lot about our need as compliance and records professionals to understand that dynamic, and then to understand the kinds of data that we have to be able to manage, not just then from a retention or disposition perspective, but making sure that our practices are actually mitigating this cyber risk as well. And then we get into this business resiliency and tech disruption risk, which is actually pretty much in line with market risks. And this also comes back to us as some changes in some regulations that have been promulgated as well. Okay, so I get into I call this government and governance. And so this is where the government is trying to get enterprises to have levels of different governance, data governance, and resiliency. This is happening across the globe. This part of kind of this governance framework is really focused on providing protection to enterprises and organizations in a country and the resiliency for them to operate against a range of risks and threats. This isn't about protecting national security. This is about protecting national interest. National security related information, of course, has all kinds of additional levels of controls and clearances and everything else you go through. This is really focused on things that we see operating in our businesses every single day that the governments now believe are at such risk that they present an interest or a risk to the whole country. And so these rules and these regulations are focused on how do you as an organization protect your information? How do you protect it in a way that protects parties and citizens in the country? How do you make sure that third parties that you work with also adhere to these things? And one of the other things that comes into this is, and there's some great commentary if somebody wants, I can give you some additional references, but people talk about the need to maintain, and the regulators talk about the need to maintain the integrity and the availability of records that are critical or necessary for appropriate oversight and enforcement, right? So part of this is not just, hey, we need you to be able to operate. We need the energy grid to operate. We need healthcare institutions and the financial markets to operate if there's a cyber event. It's that this data and the records that you're maintaining are critical for the oversight function as the government as well. And so if you expose those, or if those are not appropriately protected, or your business is not appropriately resilient, that actually inhibits the government from doing its job. So all of these rules that are coming out, and I've got them listed below, one for the UK, one for the US, and one for Australia, um, also contain levels of data sovereignty. And the data sovereignty requirements are this data is of high enough national interest that the data has to be maintained or managed within a geography, right? So can't leave the geography if it meets certain, if it's of a certain class, if it's of a certain type, if it's of a certain criticality in an industry. And that data has to stay within the four corners of the boundary of that nation state, even though traditionally we would think of data as moving across borders at the speed of light. So then what was also interesting in this KPMG's risk survey that I wanted to bring up, and this just came out, that's why, and I thought there was some great and relevant information in this. So that they asked the question, what are the top tools or solutions you're looking to use to accelerated risk management across your portfolio? And maybe not surprisingly, because it is what it is today, AI and ML were at the top of the list. How exactly that was going to fit the risk management function will be for my next topic that we'll cover, but in another session. But the second one was just really stunning to me, and I've shared this with a few other people, and we were all kind of shocked by this. If you're a chief risk officer, the second thing you think about is cloud-based solutions to secure data storage and accessibility. And it turns out that it's true. And we see this actually in the clients that we talk with. A lot of data sits in legacy systems, and a lot of data sits in on-prem environments. Those are the highest risk, highest breached, or most often breached, lack of control and lack of resiliency systems there are on the planet. Right now, NAS environments are some of the highest risk platforms that are out there. And that data has been breached or subject to ransomware multiple times in almost every single industry. Legacy systems that have outdated or legacy authentication systems are the most breached. 70% of the breaches in financial markets occur in authentication systems that, or in applications where the authentication systems are old or ineffective, right? So the chief risk officers now realize that the second most important thing they can do is get data into secure cloud-based environments that have the highest levels of control and the highest and the most resilient technologies that are out there that almost no organizations and even government organizations can't easily deploy, manage, or invest in. So moving data to modern cloud-based environment turns out to be this big risk management function. And that's actually something that we should embrace, and is certainly one of the trends that we see. So this is going to be an example where I'm going to use, and there is an Australia reference in here, but I'm going to do a little bit of a diversion into something that's happened primarily in the US and in Europe, but is a great lesson in what's going to happen elsewhere. Not so much in the enforcement and the fines, because we here in the US and the EU tend to fine much more heavily than Australia, even even with the currency exchange rate. But because it actually is something that's really important about how do we manage records and data for an organization. So, um, and this talks about the use of BYOD devices, third-party communication, and data sharing applications, and employees using their own devices, which we often ask them to do. And then they use ephemeral and third-party communication systems and solutions that basically um, are completely out of our control. We have no ability to understand if records were shared. We have no ability to understand what business was conducted. We have potentially no ability to even short of a subpoena or a warrant to go get that data from a private party. And yet it might be business records. And so in the US and in Europe, we had this instance where financial services firms, the employees in the financial services firms and investment banks were using these ephemeral and third-party chats, WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, whatever it might be, and all kinds of communication and business was being conducted outside of the channels that were approved. And these records that were supposed to be kept obviously were gone, they were lost or never captured. And to date, we're almost up to $2 billion in U.S. fines, and that's both here and in Europe. And then because of this, the U.S. Justice Department issued guidance in 2023, and that's obviously our chief law enforcement federal agency. And they basically every year they'll come out with a series of like, hey, this year we're really concerned about these things, and we want everybody on notice that this is what we're concerned about. And this year, as part of this is how we evaluate your compliance program. If you've got a problem and somebody's done something has gone wrong or somebody's done something wrong, we look at, well, did you have an effective compliance program to decide whether or not we're going to charge you or how you're going to get charged? And now they're looking at this not just from a regulatory framework where companies are subject to very strict regulations, but more broadly in organizations like, well, you've got compliance programs that say, hey, I need to keep this information. I need to keep it for this period of time and in this form and in with these methods. But if you know you have all of these off-channel communications and data sharing happening, you're not really complying even with your own program. So you got to get control of it. It's a very challenging issue, but it's real because the more people that are out there doing business in off-channel comms or sharing data outside of your systems, that's just all kinds of breach, exposure, and lack of control of your business records. It's like I said, it's a complicated issue. It's not going to go away. And so I bring this up because in Europe, this is starting to gain a lot of traction as well. Now, Australia's got a few things out there, and people maybe send me a note afterwards if I'm missing some. But this one was interesting. Like the signals director has some stuff out there about, hey, how is it that you're supposed to manage mobile devices? There was some other commentary I saw again around, hey, you got these record keeping rules. How do you make sure that if you're using BYOD devices, you're keeping up with your compliance and your record keeping rules? Okay, so now if you were here last time, I'm going to go through the modern data landscape just briefly for those that weren't here before. Hopefully, you'll get something out of this. This is a forecast for the growth of data over the next several years. And it looks at both structured and unstructured data, which you'll see in a second really is just think of this all as data. Generative AI is creating data at scales today that are going to dwarf what people do, right? Just in just minutes, I can issue a prompt and end up with a 10-page document, or I can end up with source code, or I can end up with whatever it might be. So generative AI is going to create volumes of data and at rates that people have never done, and it's already happening. Structured data and applications where this data lives, the age and the complexity of those systems and all of the security and compliance issues that I raised before are going to accelerate the need to get the data out of those systems. You don't want data in there, even in the operational systems. As soon as that data is no longer of real need, you want to get it out of the operational systems because they're not designed to handle it long term. Analytics today are able to work across a range of this data. It's not just, hey, I have something that can index some data and I have a SQL query that I can go and execute against something else. we're seeing platforms, and even those that we build, platforms that can work across these sets of data because you have to, because this is what your data environment looks like. It's a range of data, or we call it, or I guess I called it a continuum, which is, you've got things like email or files that are, heavily unstructured data, maybe with a little structure to them. And then as you proceed to the right, you get different forms of data. Well, I've got like a transaction associated with a document, or I've got some flat files or semi-structured data that's also associated with some other object or data or record. And then I get into these structured systems that have various levels of complexity. And I know there's a tendency to say, well, is it data or content or information, or it doesn't matter anymore. Just don't have the argument. It's metaphysical. None of us will actually yield much benefit from trying to define what's structured, what's content, what's information versus data. It's all just data. You can call it all just information. You can call it all just content, whatever you want to do. This is what the real landscape looks like, and that's what you have to just be focused on and understand that you're going to have this range of data or information or content that you're going to have to work with and understand how to do it. And today, modern architectures are starting to be able to handle that difference. And then you have to be able to apply governance on top of that. The data and the obligations go together, right? So any set or piece of data has more than one obligation associated with it. It's got security, it's got privacy, sovereignty, retention, all these things associated with that piece of data. It doesn't just have security. Rarely does a piece of data just have a data sovereignty issue. It has all of these issues, or many of these issues and obligations. So you have to understand, well, how can I build frameworks and build platforms and build practices that actually treat data and look at data across these obligations in one place or in one framework, so that I don't have to do this 15 different times in 15 different places, which everybody will just pull their hair out in order to get there. Finally, before I get into the predictions for 2024, I wanted to bring up this slide. And I know, again, at first, you might be like, hey, what does this really have to do with records or compliance professionals? So this is a view of the mergers and acquisitions for the governance, risk, and compliance market, technology market. And it's actually important because you have to think about, mergers and acquisitions and investments is a proxy for at least the perceived value and need of a solution in a market, right? So if everybody looked at governance, risk, and compliance solutions, were like, this is not very interesting. There's no real market there. This is all pretty boring stuff. Nobody would be investing in it, right? And if you look at the growth over the last 5 years, both in the deal flow, that is how many deals are being done, and then you look at the total and average price paid at deal time, we're at a record. Now we've had a slight, don't worry about the slight decrease in the deal flow from 2022 to 2023, because the data's not over yet, and by the end of the year that'll be up. So the important thing here is the market is also telling us that the technology and the solutions that we're building in this space are valued because they're needed. And they're needed, again, because it go up. The macro is driving this. The macro is driving huge volumes of data of disparate types, of many different forms, and across many different obligations. So it's just a really good proxy for where we're headed. Okay, so now I'm going to do my best predictions for 2024. I predict I pick 10, because that seems to be what everybody does at the end of the year. And what I've tried to do is pick them kind of in a couple of categories, and then hopefully what they mean for you as a compliance or a records professional. All right, so the first one is, and I have to do this because it's just true, which is, AI remains center stage. It's at the center of everything you hear about. You can't turn the news on for more than 5 minutes without hearing about it. But more importantly, as I indicated before, it's driving the information creation, consumption, use, and analytics around it. So the first thing I've got here is I'm predicting, and I think this is not a really big stretch, AI models, training, and decisions become a new class of business records. You have to understand how AI, and this is one area where the governments are really definitely trying to get their head around. Understand how AI models were trained, what data they were using for what time periods. Also for organizations, they need to just understand that to run their business. But the governments want to understand that because they want to understand, well, how are these decisions actually arrived at? If I'm using AI to verify, compliance with something, to do privacy, to protect data, to analyze data, I need to understand what was used and how that was done. That in and of itself will become a business record. Separate apart from that, generative AI creates its own set of new business records, right? We talked about that. I can issue a prompt and I can have, 20 different versions of a memo generated in a few minutes. So that creates its own records that we kind of understand. But this whole thing about how that system was trained, what models were created, how the models were created, and what decisions were arrived at based on AI, those will become business records in some form. We'll see the first set of regulatory enforcement actions on AI and ML performance. Privacy is in the crosshairs in the EU. There's no question. I mean, if the EU set up a special task force just to look at ChatGPT, there's going to be others. And the EU, when they set up a task force, they tend to find, they look for something that they find something they're looking for. In the US, there's a regulator here. It's called the US Consumer Finance Protection Board. It's basically it's a regulator to try and protect consumer finance, so credit cards, payday loans, things like that. Just consumer credit, right? We're not talking about corporate credit. And there's all kinds of laws and regulations about, hey, you cannot discriminate against people based on where they live, based on their zip code, obviously based on their demographics. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations around that. And there have been indications in the past sometimes that those rules, even based on models that were created before, mathematical models, but not the AI, ML models that we think of, had some sort of impact on discriminating against particular races or particular people based on geography. And so those rules and regulations are on the books. And the US Consumer Finance Regulator published a letter this year saying, we don't even need new regulations. We have them all in the books. And basically it was, and if your AI and ML does any of these things, it doesn't matter to us. It's the same thing as if George made that decision. And that's the way you almost have to think about it as well. If you're an organization, is AI, are your AI and ML making decisions that people used to, or that you had a committee used to, or whoever it was, in which case your AI and ML is going to expose you to these enforcement actions. And governments globally, no question, and I, was in Australia long enough, and I've done enough research now, like everybody's under pressure, do something, or how are you going to control some parts of AI and ML to make sure this doesn't get out of control? And the governments are trying to find a way to find that balance or get their legging. But there's enough pressure out there that people are going to find a need to do so from an enforcement perspective. And then finally, ironically, governments are going to be really slow to adopt generative AI. We're seeing this already in the U.S., where everybody in the government agencies in the federal U.S. are like, hey, we want to use these records, or sorry, we want to use AI. We want to do all these different things. But then there's a myriad of security, records, compliance, all these different purposes, the archival rules. And because so many of these tools yet don't have that stuff baked in or haven't worked to get the governance structures in place to get that data out, or to obviously the governance data around it, the governments are likely to lag the use of it. And that's good and it's bad, right? The governments are oftentimes, the agencies need a lot more help. They need better customer service and constituent services, and they're under resourced. And so it's a little bit ironic that that's going to happen, that we can't leverage it in a place we really need it. But I think it's going to be unlikely to proceed at the same pace as we would see in the commercial sector. All right, so now we get into this more data rationalization and consolidation for good governance set of predictions. And so one is, hey, we've got organizations looking to consolidate the number of data sources that they have. For the last, think especially through COVID, it was how do we create more ways for people to collaborate, communicate, share data, create data, and introduce these systems, and they were really good, but they come with a risk. Obviously, we've been accelerating the number of data sources and the volume of data for 5+ years, and now we're probably going to see a little bit of rationalization. Which of these do I really need? Do I have the right governance and controls in place? Do these meet all the risk, the risk profile and posture that we need? Do we have the records controls in place? This also is going to extend to the third parties, right? We need the third party risk and proliferation assessed as part of this. And so you'll see, I think, again, some consolidation rationalization there. The chief risk officer survey, we talked about this, on-prem data that needs to go to secure cloud environments. JP Morgan is estimating something like 1,000 exabytes of unstructured data in NAS and on-prem environments that need to move globally. And it makes sense. These are, again, very high risk, not uncontrolled, but the controls that are in place in those environments are not the same as you can get in modern cloud environments, especially if you start to restrict access to some of that data as it ages out. Um, and I keep hitting this, and I know, look, I have had every conversation with the most regulated companies and governments on the planet, and I've been there when they said this data will never leave, the four corners of this network in the highest secure facility in Switzerland, right? Or pick any country you want, and they're using cloud environments now. Why? Because enterprises and governments, most of them, cannot and are not investing even a fraction of the amount of money that hyperscalers and cloud solution providers are doing. I'm not saying that everything's moving to the cloud forever. I understand there are going to be certain workloads that stay on-prem or in hybrid environments, but a lot of this data needs to move, and cloud is going to be where it goes. And over time, even the most resistant government or organization is going to realize they can't invest and do it at the same scale that is available out there in SaaS and cloud service providers now. So there are a number of rules that I had noted around business and cyber resiliency, DORA in the UK and Europe. There's an Australian cyber resiliency rule in the US. I mentioned that as well. And it's important, again, from a compliance and records perspective, because it's actually driving a lot of what we have to do with the records, right? And with the data. Companies need to be able to operate. There has to be resiliency, access to the data that we need, access to the data if the government or somebody comes calling and asking for that data because it is a business record. So you'll see that cyber and privacy, really pushing a lot of this, but it really ultimately impacts compliance and records as we think of it more traditionally. And then finally, the data sovereignty piece continues to evolve and continues to increase in scope. As I talked about, data national interest becomes the norm. The volume of data subject to what we would consider now subject to these national interest and data sovereignty pieces is going to exceed what ever has existed for the national security piece. Data classification remains a predicate for much of those. All right, now finally, I'm going to try and lay out what I consider this data governance at more the practical level, compliance records at the practical level. And these are kind of the three more tactical or more practical things that we're likely to see. So one, retirement of legacy data and systems, high on the priority list. For the reason that I talked about from a risk perspective, data needs to come out of these operational systems, legacy systems that doesn't need to be there long-term, lacks the controls and the all the things that we've already mentioned. This use of ephemeral messaging, off-channel comms, it just becomes a broader compliance and records issue, and this will continue. The use of BYOD and these devices that are not controlled or managed by an enterprise organization or a government that just exposes that much more information potentially to a breach or lack of business control and business records and privacy. And all of those will continue to gain additional attention by regulators and by by legislatures as well. And so really think about how your organization is dealing with that dynamic. And then finally, maybe my favorite, I call this Manage in Place 2.0. So there's a drive and a move and this belief that we can manage data in place in the content systems and sources where that data has evolved, was created, and where we manage it kind of on an active day-to-day basis. And there was a version of this in any number of solution providers and technology stacks at the time, going back maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, that tried to do this because there were no controls in the source systems at that time, or very few. So it was trying to lay a set of controls and a lay of search and indexing on top of that, because those source systems had really nothing. Today, the source systems do have something. They have some level of governance. They have some level of search and control, but none of them are designed for long-term governance, security, compliance. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The most interesting example, and I have a blog that is, there's a link on the back of this, and it actually talks about AI analytics and archiving. The most interesting example is when Microsoft introduced Copilot, and introduced that. It was obviously a huge announcement for their AI and open AI support, and building that into the M365 stack. The thing that they did the very same day was introduce an archive for SharePoint, primarily right now for M365 content, because they realized that they can't manage the data in place in SharePoint at scale long term. It's going to just create an enormous AI is going to create an enormous amount of data that is not going to be designed to be managed in place indefinitely. There's a role to have that data archived out. The same thing is true in all of these other non-M365 data sources. They're not designed to manage data long term. They don't have the scale long term to do it. They don't have all of the security and other controls that will be necessary in place long term. So I know it's a big fad right now. I've seen it. I've talked to everybody about it. I've seen it fail once. I don't think it will fail this time, but I think that a lot of people next year are going to recalibrate it and rethink that there's going to be a place that some data can be managed in place for some period of time, and there's going to be a lot of data that needs to go somewhere else that can't be managed in the sources where it arose. So with that, I will stop and take any questions. I'll package these slides up too at the back. This is aside from my contact info, this is a blog I wrote about the role of basically the intersection and use of analytics, AI, and archiving, and how they kind of need to feed off one another. So I will ask if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, George. As you're writing your questions, I'm just reminding everyone that we will be sharing the recording after as well. And we'll also be sharing the slides that George mentioned and any resource link in there, including the transcription of today's webinar. Does anyone have any questions? If you come up with any questions after, feel free. I'll send you George's details as well, or feel free to send me an email if you have anything. But by the looks of it, George, I think that was pretty much it for today. Thank you so much again, and thank you everyone for participating. We really appreciate you all being here, and we really hope that you take away a lot of great learnings from these sessions. Session 3 will also be public. I think I will link it into the email going out today, so you can register for that one. And that will be pretty much everything there. Vanessa says, thank you, George. Say thank you, Vanessa.
Well, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
You do. Thanks, George. Thanks, everyone,
All
and
right.
have a really
Take
great
care.
day wherever you are in the world.